In every neighborhood, there's usually one person who believes the world should bend to their rules. For the residents of this historic street, nestled only a few blocks from the White House, that person was a woman named Karen. She wasn't just opinionated, she was determined to control every inch of what she could see from her front porch. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for only a few years, but in that short time, she had already gained a reputation. She complained about lawns being too green, porches being too cluttered, and driveways being too noisy. But none of her past complaints compared to the obsession that would soon consume her, the sight of the White House itself. From the corner of her street, there was a perfectly framed view of the White House. Neighbors often loved to pause there, admire the landmark, and take photos when the evening lights illuminated its grand columns. It was a small but cherished privilege of living in the area. A reminder of history and significance. For most, it was a point of pride. For Karen, it was a source of irritation. She began to mutter during block association meetings that the White House was a distraction, and that the constant flow of tourists, joggers, and casual visitors passing by her street disrupted her peace. At first, her complaints were brushed off as typical Karen behavior. People nodded politely and moved on to more pressing neighborhood concerns. But behind the scenes, Karen was plotting something bigger, something no one could have imagined. She filed complaints with the local homeowners association, claiming that the view of the White House encouraged traffic congestion and privacy invasion. She exaggerated stories about strangers peeking into her yard while trying to catch a glimpse of the landmark. She went so far as to collect photos, printouts, and mock-up sketches of her solution. Her idea was radical. Build a massive fence across the end of the street, effectively cutting off the public's view of the White House entirely. Her proposal was outrageous, and at first, people laughed. How could anyone think of walling off the nation's most iconic residents from their small neighborhood street? But Karen wasn't joking. She argued that the fence would protect the community from unwanted outsiders, improve security, and bring peace back to the block. And she presented her case with the same unrelenting persistence she used to file noise complaints about barking dogs or wind chimes. The HOA board, used to her constant badgering, tried to dismiss her idea quietly. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She began a campaign of letters, emails, and calls, harassing the board daily until they promised to at least consider her request. Her persistence created a ripple of unease among the neighbors. If she had gotten this far with her nonsense, what might she achieve if left unchecked? Soon, whispers spread. Some neighbors rolled their eyes at her antics, but others started to worry. Karen had a knack for manipulation, twisting facts until they sounded reasonable. She told one homeowner that tourists were a security risk. She told another that property values might drop if the street stayed crowded. By planting seeds of fear and doubt, she began to gather a small following of like-minded complainers who nodded along with her half-baked logic. The idea of a fence, absurd as it was, started to gain traction. It was no longer a laughable suggestion. It was a proposal that might actually reach a vote. And that terrified those who valued the unique beauty of their neighborhood. Among the concerned residents was a longtime homeowner named Martin, who had lived there for over 20 years. He loved the view of the White House, not only for its symbolic meaning but because it made their neighborhood one of the most charming and desirable in the city. He knew that Karen's plan wasn't just ridiculous, it was dangerous. If she managed to push it through, their neighborhood would become a punchline in news headlines across the country. Martin began documenting everything Karen was doing. He attended every meeting, collected her letters, and recorded the HOA's responses. He knew he'd need evidence if he wanted to stop her. What began as an annoyance quickly turned into a battle. It wasn't just about a fence, it was about control. If Karen won, she wouldn't stop there. She would continue to dictate every detail of the neighborhood, bending the rules to suit her whims. As weeks turned into months, the HOA reluctantly scheduled a formal vote on Karen's proposal. The day of the meeting arrived, and tension filled the air. Neighbors crowded into the community hall, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nervously whispering about what might happen. Karen strutted in with a binder full of documents, wearing the smug expression of someone convinced victory was inevitable. She presented her case with dramatic flair, waving papers, citing research, and painting a picture of a peaceful, fenced-off street free from tourists and noise. Her small group of supporters clapped enthusiastically, while others sat in stunned silence. Then came the counter-arguments. Martin stood up and spoke calmly, pointing out the absurdity of walling off a national landmark, reminding everyone of the pride and history that came with their unique location. He shared testimonials from neighbors who loved the view, and even mentioned that local businesses benefited from the steady stream of visitors. The debate raged on for hours, with tempers flaring and voices rising. But in the end, the HOA announced that the vote would be postponed until further review. Karen was furious. She stormed out, muttering about conspiracies and favoritism, vowing that this wasn't over. And she meant it. That night, neighbors noticed something strange. Delivery trucks arrived at Karen's house. Piles of lumber and fencing material were unloaded into her yard. By morning, word spread quickly: Karen wasn't going to wait for a vote. She was going to build the fence herself. The sight of wood stacked high in her driveway shocked everyone. People gathered in small groups, whispering and speculating about what she might do next. The neighborhood that once felt united was now divided, standing on the edge of an unprecedented conflict. And deep down, everyone knew, this was only the beginning. By sunrise the next day, Karen's yard was buzzing with activity. Neighbors rubbed their eyes in disbelief as they peeked through blinds and curtains, only to see workers unloading tools, hammering posts, and setting stakes into the ground. She wasn't just bluffing. She was really going to build her fence, whether the HOA approved it or not. The scale of her ambition became clear quickly. She wasn't putting up a small privacy barrier around her own property. No, she had blueprints for a massive wall-like structure that stretched across the entire end of the street, effectively cutting off the neighborhood's view of the White House. The posts went up one by one, tall and imposing, their shadows stretching across the pavement. At first, neighbors thought it was a prank. Surely the workers would stop once they realized they were building on shared land. But when asked, Karen stood proudly in her driveway, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general. She insisted she had approval and threatened to sue anyone who interfered. Her few supporters cheered her on, saying it was about time someone took charge. But most of the community was horrified. Parents who used to walk their children to the corner to admire the White House now stood with folded arms, anger simmering beneath the surface. Elderly residents who had lived there for decades couldn't believe someone would dare erase a view they had cherished for generations. Martin, who had been keeping careful records of Karen's schemes, immediately began documenting the construction. He photographed every post, every load of lumber, every delivery truck. He knew this would end badly for her, but only if the evidence was undeniable. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen might actually succeed in finishing the fence before anyone could stop her. The HOA scrambled into emergency meetings. Board members exchanged frantic calls, debating whether to issue a cease and desist order or contact local authorities. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and Karen moved fast. By the end of the first week, nearly half the fence stood tall, casting long, ugly lines across the once open and inviting street. The media began to notice. Local reporters arrived, curious about the bizarre construction blocking a historic view. Photos spread online, sparking outrage and disbelief. Comment sections exploded with mockery. How could one woman think she had the authority to wall off the White House? Memes comparing Karen to dictators spread like wildfire. But the more attention she received, the more determined she became. Karen loved the spotlight. She gave interviews from her driveway, speaking into cameras with the air of a politician. She claimed she was protecting the neighborhood, insisting the fence was for everyone's safety. She painted herself as a hero standing up against chaos. Her supporters nodded proudly beside her, though their numbers were far smaller than she wanted to admit. But behind the scenes, the neighborhood's patience was wearing thin. Tensions boiled over at every HOA meeting, voices raised and accusations flying. Longtime friends stopped speaking, divided by the chaos she had created. What was once a peaceful, historic street now felt like a battleground. Martin decided to take things further. He filed official complaints not just with the HOA but with the city and even federal authorities. After all, building a barrier that obstructed the view of a national landmark wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute, it was a matter of public interest. Still, he knew it could take weeks, maybe months, before any legal action kicked in. And in the meantime, the fence kept growing. By the second week, tourists began to show up in confusion. They had read online about the perfect view of the White House from this very street, only to find a looming wooden wall in their way. Some laughed and took photos of the absurd sight, posting them with sarcastic captions. Others were angry, yelling at Karen's workers, demanding explanations. But Karen relished it all. She stood proudly, insisting they were trespassing, waving her arms to shoo them away. The atmosphere in the neighborhood turned hostile. Every hammer strike echoed like a warning, every plank nailed into place felt like a piece of history being erased. Families who once enjoyed evening strolls now avoided the street entirely. Even children whispered about the monster fence, their games overshadowed by the towering wall. But cracks in Karen's plan were starting to show. The cost of construction was skyrocketing, and rumors spread that she had taken out loans to fund the project. The workers she hired grew restless, complaining about late payments. Deliveries slowed, leaving piles of unfinished wood stacked haphazardly in her yard. One evening, as the sun set behind the half-finished fence, Martin stood at the corner and took in the sight. The White House, once framed perfectly in the distance, was now obscured by planks and shadows. But he knew this wouldn't last forever. The fence was illegal, and sooner or later, the law would catch up with Karen. And catch up, it did. One morning, weeks into construction, unmarked cars pulled onto the street. City officials and federal inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, scanning the towering fence with stern expressions. Neighbors gathered silently, their hearts racing with anticipation. Karen marched up confidently, convinced she could talk her way through any challenge. She waved her documents, shouted about her rights, and tried to paint herself as the victim once again. But this time, her charm didn't work. The inspectors pointed out violations, citing multiple codes she had broken. She had built on shared land without permits. She had obstructed a federally protected view. And worst of all, she had ignored repeated warnings from the HOA and the city. The inspectors delivered a clear order: construction had to stop immediately, and the fence would need to come down. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. For a moment, Karen's face twisted in shock. But then, almost instantly, she doubled down, shouting that she would fight this in court, that she wouldn't let outsiders tell her what to do. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door, leaving the officials shaking their heads. The workers packed up their tools, muttering under their breath. The neighborhood stood in silence, staring at the half-finished monstrosity that still loomed over their street. They had won a small battle, but the war wasn't over. Everyone knew Karen wasn't done. And as night fell, lights glowed from her windows late into the night. Papers shuffled, phone calls were made, and plans were whispered through her walls. Whatever she was planning next, it would be bigger, louder, and more destructive. The neighborhood braced itself. The real fight had only just begun. The neighborhood thought the storm had passed when the inspectors ordered construction to stop. The unfinished fence stood as a half-built monument to Karen's stubbornness, looming over the street like a scar. For a few days, peace seemed to return. The workers were gone, the hammering stopped, and the HOA dared to believe the ordeal was finally ending. But they underestimated Karen. Behind the closed curtains of her home, she was plotting her next move. To her, the inspector's orders were not the end but a challenge. She convinced herself that she was a victim of corruption, that government officials and jealous neighbors had conspired to silence her. She began calling lawyers, sending emails to reporters, and scribbling notes late into the night. She wasn't going to let anyone tear down what she had started. Within weeks, legal documents started arriving at the HOA office. Karen was suing the Homeowners Association, claiming they had discriminated against her. She was suing the city for unfair treatment. She even attempted to file motions against federal authorities, arguing that her fence was a matter of personal freedom. Her lawsuits were messy, disorganized, and filled with emotional outbursts, but they were enough to throw the neighborhood into chaos. The HOA, unprepared for such a barrage, scrambled to find attorneys to defend themselves. Meetings that once focused on landscaping and community events were now dominated by discussions of legal fees and court hearings. Residents watched in disbelief as their association's budget drained away, spent on fighting battles they never wanted. Karen, meanwhile, reveled in the attention. She gave interviews to any media outlet willing to listen. Standing proudly in front of her half-built fence, she declared herself a fighter for neighborhood rights. Some local papers painted her as a comical figure, but others amplified her voice, turning her into a symbol of resistance against so-called overreach. She loved it. Cameras captured her dramatic speeches, her finger wagging at officials, her proclamations of victory even when she was losing. Her supporters, though still a small group, became louder. They posted online about freedom, property rights, and standing up to the system. Trolls and strangers who had never set foot in the neighborhood flooded social media with comments, cheering her on. What began as a local dispute was spiraling into a spectacle. The neighborhood suffered most. Tourists stopped visiting, discouraged by the ugly fence and the hostile atmosphere. Businesses nearby reported fewer customers. Homeowners who had once boasted about their view of the White House now felt embarrassed to even mention where they lived. And all the while, Karen smiled for the cameras, convinced she was making history. But cracks were forming in her foundation. The lawsuits, though dramatic, were weak. Judges dismissed her claims one after another, citing lack of evidence and frivolous arguments. Each loss only made her more determined. She ranted online, calling the courts corrupt, the HOA tyrannical, and her neighbors traitors. She plastered signs in her yard declaring she was under attack, turning her home into a circus for anyone passing by. Martin, ever watchful, kept gathering evidence. He recorded her rants, collected news clippings, and saved court documents. He knew her downfall was inevitable, but he also knew it would take patience. Karen wasn't going to collapse overnight. She would fight until she burned herself out, and until then, the neighborhood had to endure. One evening, as neighbors gathered quietly in Martin's living room, they shared their frustrations. Families spoke of their children being scared by the shouting reporters outside. Elderly residents confessed they no longer felt safe on their own street. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about a community being torn apart. Martin assured them that justice would come, but he also warned them, Karen was unpredictable, and her next move could be even worse. And he was right. Karen's obsession took a darker turn when she began filing complaints directly against individual neighbors. She accused one family of illegal renovations. She reported another for excessive noise when their children played outside. She even claimed Martin was harassing her simply by walking past her house. These complaints, though baseless, created fear. People worried they might be her next target. The HOA inbox flooded with her endless messages, drowning the board in chaos. Meanwhile, the unfinished fence loomed as a constant reminder of her defiance. The wood began to warp in the rain, nails rusting, planks splintering. What once stood as her grand project now decayed into an eyesore, attracting rats and weeds. Yet she refused to let anyone touch it. The inspector's orders had been clear, but she ignored them, daring anyone to challenge her. It was around this time that national news picked up the story. A late-night comedy show mocked her, dubbing her the "Fence Queen of Washington." Clips of her rants went viral, edited with dramatic music and sarcastic captions. Strangers laughed, but for the neighborhood, it was no joke. They had to live with her chaos every day. Karen, however, interpreted the attention as validation. She boasted online that millions were watching, that she was inspiring people across the country. She stood taller, spoke louder, and pushed harder, blind to the fact that the world was laughing at her, not with her. But while she basked in her false glory, powerful forces were moving quietly against her. The city had grown tired of her antics. Federal agencies, once hesitant to intervene, began investigating the legality of her actions. And the HOA, though battered, was preparing a counterstrike. Late one night, Martin sat at his desk, sifting through the mountain of evidence he had collected. He knew the end was near. Karen's lawsuits were crumbling, her fence was rotting, and her neighbors were united in their determination to see her stopped. But he also knew something else. Before Karen fell, she would lash out one final time. She would try to make one last desperate move, something outrageous, something that would either cement her as a martyr in her own mind or finally expose her as the villain she truly was. The neighborhood braced itself for that final act. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation. People avoided eye contact on the street, whispering about what might come next. The once peaceful corner near the White House had become a stage for chaos, and everyone knew the climax was approaching. The only question was, how far would Karen go before the curtain finally fell? The weeks that followed were tense and uneasy. The neighborhood lived in a strange limbo, caught between the fading noise of Karen's lawsuits and the looming question of what she would do next. The half-finished fence still stood like a skeleton at the end of the street, warped and weathered, a constant reminder of her defiance. Reporters no longer swarmed as they once had, but tourists still came, pointing and laughing, snapping photos of the bizarre structure blocking the view of the White House. For the residents, the spectacle had become unbearable. The pride they once felt in their unique neighborhood had been poisoned. Even real estate agents whispered about how property values were slipping, warning potential buyers that they'd be living in Karen's neighborhood. The community's reputation was crumbling, and all of it traced back to one person. Karen, however, refused to admit defeat. Though her lawsuits had been thrown out one after another, she insisted publicly that she was merely waiting for the right judge to hear her case. Online, she declared herself a patriot standing against tyranny, though most commenters mocked her mercilessly. She clung to the illusion of power, blind to the fact that the world had already moved on. But deep inside, she knew her grip was slipping. And that was when desperation set in. One chilly evening, long after the neighborhood had settled into uneasy quiet, the sound of engines roared back to life. Delivery trucks once again rolled down the street, their headlights cutting through the dark. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains in disbelief. Karen was at it again. This time, she wasn't just hauling lumber. She had ordered massive metal panels, industrial posts, and concrete mix. Her plan was clear: if she couldn't finish the wooden fence, she would build something even bigger, even stronger, even more permanent. She called it her Freedom Wall, a towering barrier she claimed would finally shut out the chaos of the outside world. The noise carried late into the night as hired crews began unloading materials. Floodlights lit up her yard as she barked orders, waving her arms like a commander preparing for battle. Her small group of supporters cheered her on, shouting that they wouldn't let the government control them. But the rest of the neighborhood watched in silent horror. By morning, the construction had begun again. Metal posts were driven into the ground with thunderous force, concrete poured into makeshift molds. The sight was worse than before, ugly, imposing, and completely illegal. The unfinished wooden fence stood beside it like a rotting skeleton, dwarfed by the gleaming steel rising beside it. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. Calls flooded the HOA office, the city council, and even federal hotlines. The story reignited online, spreading like wildfire. Photos of the Freedom Wall went viral, sparking outrage across the country. Commentators mocked the absurdity. Late-night hosts once again used her as comedic fodder. But beneath the laughter was real concern. How could one woman defy the law so openly, right in the shadow of the White House? Authorities could no longer ignore it. Within days, the street was swarmed not by construction crews but by law enforcement. Trucks blocked off the road, and uniformed officers surrounded Karen's property. Officials from multiple agencies arrived, armed with legal documents and court orders. The neighborhood gathered at a distance, holding their breath, knowing this was the moment they had been waiting for. Karen emerged from her house defiantly, clutching papers, shouting about rights and conspiracies. She waved her arms, screamed at the officers, and declared she would never back down. Her voice cracked with desperation, but her pride refused to let her stop. Cameras from local news stations caught every second, beaming her meltdown across the country. But the officers were unmoved. They read her the orders, clear and final: the fence was illegal, it was coming down, and she was prohibited from interfering. Her voice grew shrill as she screamed that this was a violation of her freedom, but her words fell on deaf ears. Slowly, one by one, the metal posts were cut down. The wooden fence, already crumbling, was torn apart and hauled away. Sawdust and splinters filled the air as the structure that had divided the neighborhood was dismantled piece by piece. The crowd of neighbors watched in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet smiles of relief. Years of frustration, months of tension, and endless nights of conflict were being erased in front of their eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, the view of the White House reappeared, glowing in the distance like a beacon. Karen screamed as the walls fell, her voice hoarse, her face red with fury. She shouted at the workers, at the officers, at her neighbors, accusing them all of betrayal. She threatened more lawsuits, swore she would rebuild, vowed she would never give up. But the words no longer carried weight. The cameras captured her rage, but the world only saw a woman undone by her own obsession. When the last post was pulled from the ground, silence fell over the street. The air felt lighter, the view unobstructed once more. Children laughed as they ran to the corner, pointing at the White House in excitement. Neighbors hugged, tears mixing with laughter. The nightmare was finally over. Karen, meanwhile, stood alone in her yard, surrounded by debris. Her supporters had vanished, her lawsuits dismissed, her fence destroyed. What she had built to symbolize control now lay in ruins, a pile of broken wood and bent steel. Her reign as the self-proclaimed fence queen had ended, not with triumph but with humiliation. Over the following weeks, her presence faded. The media moved on, the neighborhood rebuilt its reputation, and the White House view once again became a point of pride. Property values climbed, tourists returned, and the community began to heal. But Karen remained, a shadow of her former self, rarely seen outside. Her house, once the loudest on the block, grew silent. For the neighbors, the lesson was clear. One person's obsession could wreak havoc, but unity and persistence could overcome even the most stubborn opponent. They had endured months of chaos, ridicule, and division, but in the end, the community had stood firm. The White House view was safe, and peace had returned. As for Karen, her story became a cautionary tale whispered at HOA meetings and block gatherings. She had tried to wall off history itself, to cage the pride of a neighborhood, to control what no one had the right to control. And in doing so, she had lost everything: her credibility, her respect, and her imagined throne of power. The fence was gone, but the memory lingered. And every time the neighbors gathered at the corner to admire the shining columns of the White House, they remembered the battle they had fought, and the strange woman who had tried to build a fence around it. The war was over. The view was theirs again. And the neighborhood would never forget.